This video is on the early settlers of North America. Now, the first people to come to America actually came for exploration purposes. They came in about the 15th century. People you may know like Christopher Columbus, Coronado, Cabeza de Vaca. The reasons that they came for exploring was that first they were hoping to find a faster trade route to China. They also were hopeful that they might find the fabled earthly paradise that contains a cure for all diseases. Maybe they would find some rivers filled with gold. Or the fabled fountain of youth. But the most important thing that they wanted was adventure. Well, eventually people came to settle down and live here permanently. And those are what we refer to as the first settlers. Now, while they still had the desire for adventure and gold, the main reason they wanted to settle in this new land was because food was plentiful, and poor people could own land and earn good wages. In Europe, if you were born poor, you stayed poor, and there was nothing you could do to rise above that. But in America, here was an opportunity to be something more. The first settlement was settled in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Now, this is considered in the South. It doesn't look much like it's in the South. Looks like it's in the middle to me, but that is the South. It was established by John Smith and others. John Smith was not really very well liked, but he was largely responsible for the settlement's survival. He is what we consider our first American writer. He wrote of his adventures in settling America. His account of the New World is what attracted people to want to come and move and live in America. Now, he was realistic in describing the harshness of living in America, but he appealed to people's sense of adventure and heroism because he wanted them to want to come and settle in America. Because of this, he developed this legend of Pocahontas. Now, she was a real person. He tells of how she was this brave, young Native American princess who saved him from being executed by her father. As I said, she definitely existed, but it's generally believed that most of that story is really just fabricated. It's embellished a bit. Maybe he wanted to appeal to the sense of adventure, and so he wrote an adventureful story for everyone else to hear. Now, Southern writing really was written mostly for their own amusement or diversion rather than for instruction or inspiration. They wrote a lot about nature and society, particularly the wilderness and what frontier life was like. Now, while God was mentioned occasionally, they were Christians, he was not the primary focus of their writing. And that brings us to the next settlement, where God was a primary focus. The Puritans came and settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. Just to give you an idea of the difference between the settlements, there's where Jamestown is. So we have our northern settlement in Plymouth and our southern settlement in Jamestown. This second settlement were the people that you know as the Pilgrims. We're calling them Puritans. Puritans and Pilgrims, same thing. They came over on the Mayflower and they settled in what is known as New England. Now, the Puritans were named such because they refused to follow the mandatory religion, which was Church of England. They wanted to purify the church by returning to more simpler forms of worship and church organization that more closely resembled biblical models. Now, because they separated themselves from the Church of England, they suffered oppression, persecution in England. Some were jailed and whipped. Coming to America was a way for them to escape this religious oppression and be able to practice religion as they saw fit. Now, the Puritans were so devoted to their religious beliefs that every aspect of their lives was affected by it. They wanted to devote themselves to living as life was at the time of Christ and eliminate anything that came after. So they kept their homes and villages simple. Their churches, which they called meeting houses, were simple. There was no ornamentation or art allowed. They felt that those things detracted from the pure worship of God. They also kept their writing simple, using what we call the plain style. They avoided complicated figures of speech or references to Latin or mythology, things like what Shakespeare would do. They didn't want to write as complicated as people like Shakespeare would write. The main purpose of their writing was to glorify God. They also used writing to look for inner and outer signs of the workings of God in their lives. So mostly that came down to writing diaries and histories. They also, some of them wrote poetry, and they always tried to make connections between biblical events and events in their own lives. Now, there are many beliefs that pervade Puritan writing and influenced American culture. The most important of these is grace, which is a gift from God, and you have to have it in order to get into heaven. So this is something that they really, really wanted. Ephesians 2, verse 8 and 9 says, "For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." Well, not everyone received this gift, only what they called the elect. Because no one knew for certain who was chosen and who was not to receive this grace, they tried to behave as though they were, and they constantly searched their lives for signs of that grace. That's why many had diaries. They were trying to keep a record of anything that may show evidence of grace in their lives. They wanted that grace to be able to get to heaven. Another important belief was God's providence. This is the idea that God provides everything that we need. It's also the idea that anything that happens because that's how God wants it. So if your house burns down, that's because God wanted that way, and that's something that you had to accept. We will read a poem about someone's house burning down, and she feels that it's something that God wanted. Another Puritan belief was the idea of a divine mission. They felt that God sent them to America to be an example of what Christianity is supposed to be to the rest of the world. You could kind of compare America to the promised land that the Israelites had. They felt like New England was their new Jerusalem. Another Puritan belief was the idea of shunning materialism. They wanted to focus on heavenly things rather than earthly things. The idea is that everything on earth is temporary. Your home, your clothes, everything. It can't come with you, right? So they wanted to focus on the permanent things of the next life, their relationship with God in heaven. Some more beliefs that they had were self-reliance and industriousness. Coming to a new land that had never been settled before, they had to rely on themselves. They did live in communities, so they could rely on each other and a sense of community, but they really had to rely on themselves. Now, industriousness means working hard. They had to work hard if they planned to survive in this new land. Another belief is the idea that the ministers were appointed by God and they could not be disputed. What they said was law. Now, life for the Puritans was very strict. They had to abide by church laws, and they never celebrated religious holidays. They could not work on Sundays or drink alcohol or pretty much do anything that was any fun. If anyone committed any sin, they were publicly chastised for it and sometimes outcasted. This is, of course, ironic because they came to America to seek religious freedom but refused to give it to anyone else within their community. Alright, so I've talked so far about two very different settlements, and they had different types of lives both in the North and in the South. We can see even from the very first settlements the division in our country. The first difference is religion. In the North, they were Puritans. They wanted to be pure. They didn't like that the Church of England was doing extra things besides what Christ would want. And in the South, they just went along with the Church of England just like everyone else in England did. Another difference was the climate. In the North, they had long, cold winters. The land was hard to plant. They had to work very hard for everything that they got. In the South, it was warmer. The land was more fertile. They didn't have as many struggles. I'm sure they struggled a little bit, but not as much as those in the North. In the South, or in the North, they had a village community. People owned small plots of land. They did all of the labor themselves. And remember, they couldn't work on Sundays. And in the South, they had large plantations, huge territories of land, because the land was much easier to work. and eventually it was primarily labored by slaves. Now, the way that they acted was that the Puritans were very much about searching their lives for signs of grace. So they were soul-searching individualists, not really concerned about, manners. Of course, they wanted to make sure that they abided by the church law, but in the South, they were much more attentive to manners and social types of things. What do they have in common? A desire to convey the special quality of life in America. They wanted to show how they felt living in a new land and facing new experiences. Well, we're mostly going to read Puritan writers, and we're going to start with William Bradford. He was the first leader and governor of Plymouth, Massachusetts, that first northern settlement that we talked about. He wrote a journal which chronicled the voyage on the Mayflower and the struggles of the first northern settlement. We're going to read parts of that. He also is responsible for telling us of the first Thanksgiving. Now, as we read Bradford's account of the trip to America, you're going to want to make note of his references to God and the Bible. And that is all. Happy reading.